Muscle. Most people have an idea about muscle, but they have no idea about how it works. They think, well, you drink a protein shake and you lift some weights. But really, it's about calcium and ATP. ATP are tiny packets of energy. And they're going to be the force that drives the contraction and relaxation of muscle. You see, muscle doesn't really shrink or expand. It slides. It slides. Think of it, if you grab a raw piece of steak, big thick piece of steak, you can't really stretch it much. There's two proteins. One is called actin, and actin in this case is the bubbly thing. It's a globular protein, and it responds to calcium. Now when calcium binds, you see those little white bubbles? That's calcium. When calcium binds to the actin, then there's myosin. Let's talk about myosin for a minute. Myosin is the other protein that has these heads, these double heads. And you see that little ADP? Oh, ATP. There's that energy I talked about. And you'll see a power stroke in a few seconds, because ATP is what generates the power stroke. Now I know a lot of this is coming fast, and we'll take it step by step. But with ATP, there's the power stroke. Now ADP is the low energy, and the body has to pump another phosphate to get another power stroke. In this way, myosin with its head is going to pull itself along. There we go. Pull, pull, and it's going to shorten or contract the muscle fiber. Pretty slick. If we look at muscle under the microscope, we see these striations or stripes, and that's because of the actin and myosin fibers that are laying side by side. The dark bands, we call those Z's, and then there's an A band, which is where there's both thick and thin fibers. So the lower right, you'll see what muscle looks like under a microscope with the Z bands that sort of anchor each sarcomere or unit of muscle. Back to these words, actin and myosin. These are the major players in this whole game. So this entire lecture, this first part, is about primarily actin and myosin. Actin is the one that moves, and myosin is the one with those golf ball heads. Now, I drew this diagram below because, and you might do the same on a piece of paper, because sometimes we need to visualize this thing. It's not as complicated as it first looks. There's myosin with a head. There's actin with a binding site. That's that little white ball I have there. That's the binding site where the myosin head is going to attach and form a cross bridge. Now, muscle contractions begin from the nervous system via a motor neuron. The motor neuron is going to send an impulse to the myofibrils that are on each packet or bundle of cells. Once we get the neural stimulation, then the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or SR, is going to cause calcium to flow outwards. Now, if you remember that first video, calcium is required to stimulate actin. Right. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, stick with me, because here comes the rest of the story. I like this. I like the one on the right side. You'll see actin is that globular protein, and it has this troponin that's wrapped around it. And you might think, well, who cares? But see, you can't contract a muscle unless this happens. So that the troponin is blocking the binding site. It's kind of like, let's say you have you're a girl and you have a boyfriend. Well, that boyfriend is going to block any other guys from stepping into your personal space, right? But along comes calcium. Calcium is going to bind to troponin, and now that wraparound tropomyosin, it's called, is going to shift. It's going to shift to the side, exposing that binding site. So this is like if someone took out your boyfriend and now you're available. I don't know. Maybe it's a bad, but do you get the point? Calcium is going to cause tropomyosin to slide to the side, exposing the binding site. Who cares about exposing the binding site? Well, now, and only now, myosin steps in. Myosin with that head can form a cross bridge, so it connects temporarily to the actin at the binding site. Now we can't just connect, because then we're not going anywhere, right? We want to go places. So now we have the power stroke that I talked about earlier. Myosin head is going to tilt towards the center of the sarcomere, and now we have that sliding actin filament. So actin moves. Actin has action. The myosin is there with the power strokes. Without ATP and calcium, I mentioned earlier, the contraction is not going to occur. And I have a nice little video here of that cross bridge. With actin binding to the myosin, okay, here's the muscle tissue. Let's get a little point of reference. Contraction. And if we look inside the muscle fibers, we're going to see the myosin with the golf club heads and the actin which slides. So those are, oh, there's a sarcomere. Good review. If you remember, sarcomere has Z bands and A bands in the middle. A bands are where it's really dense. And if you see those little bouncing particles, that's the calcium. And calcium's going to bind to actin. And there we get the contraction. So you see the muscles don't really stretch, they slide. And here's a close-up, actin at the top, myosin down below. There's calcium. It's going to bind to actin. And if you remember my story, the binding of calcium troponin is going to cause the tropomyosin. It's blocking the binding site, right? There it slides. Aha! Now the binding site's available for the myosin head, which is going to, it needs ATP to drive the reaction. And now we have a cross bridge. It's temporary because remember, we want a power stroke to force the actin to slide. There's ADP, that's a low energy, but then creatine phosphate, which our bodies naturally release from the sarcomeres, creatine phosphate is going to create another phosphate, and now we can get that power stroke and force the actin to slide along. Now, some people buy creatine phosphate for their workouts, but really, if you're in good shape, your body produces plenty of it. So really, the creatine is just something that overworks the kidneys, I suppose. Or if you're out of shape, maybe it gives you a little bit of an edge. Alright, there's the power stroke. Come on, let's see it. Sure is slow. There we go. Okay, let's move on. Here's my diagram. I'm into diagrams. My brain seems to work this way. There's the actin. There's the binding site. There's ATP. Myosin head. So with the ATP, we get that grip and the power stroke. Now, when we die, we no longer make ATP because the sarcomere is not releasing it. And so we get a cross bridge that's not broken. There's no power stroke. And rigor mortis is sometimes used in forensics because we can tell about how long the person's been dead. Generally, this rigor mortis lasts 24 to 60 hours, but it depends on the temperature and other conditions that involve the death. We all feel muscle twitches, and that's when the motor neurons send impulses into the muscle fibers, and they contract. We call this an all or nothing response because muscles don't partially respond. They get the impulse from the motor neuron. Okay, a little review there. And then they fire. Now, if it's a sustained twitch, that's called tetanus. And it can be very painful, such as a spasm, or it can even be involved with an infection. Here we have a good example of two types of contractions. Isotonic is the one we usually think of, where there's a sliding process. But isometric is where, okay, we have calcium released, ATP is involved, but the sarcomeres do not shorten. And here's a good example with Kyle doing about 600-pound deadlift. You're going to see at first the isometric. He's going to flex his muscles, and so he's releasing calcium and ATP, but the muscles aren't sliding. And then finally he makes this isotonic move. So there's two moves taking place here. There we go. Isometric, isotonic. Great lift, Kyle. Review here. We have those cross bridges. We have myosin, actin. Myosin is going to make that cross bridge. ATP is required for the power stroke. Little vocabulary, myofibril, that's just the fibers. Sarcomere is that contractile section of the muscle tissue. It releases creatine phosphate to turn ADP into ATP, high energy. Actin is the action one, myosin with the power stroke. The SR, stimulated by a motor neuron, releases calcium. ATP, high energy. Rigor mortis when there's no ATP, so the cross bridge remains. Muscle twitch, we get a prolonged one would be a tetanus. Isotonic is that sliding action. Isometric is where there's no sliding, but the muscle is active. Pretty cool stuff.